Hello everyone, Dr. Mad here. Let's get mad about poetry. So in this video, we are going to look at Exposure, 1920 by Wilfred Owen. Exposure is a poem about World War One, but it's not a description of the war as such. It's about the freezing weather that the soldiers have to endure, which can be just as bad, if not worse, than the war itself. So in that sense, it is also about the power of nature. And there we have Wilfred Owen. So a little bit about the poet. 1893 to 1918, born in Shropshire, England, one of Britain's greatest war poets. He wrote from intense personal experience of the front line, and his poems bring to life the physical and mental trauma of combat. Owen's aim was to tell the truth about what he called the pity of war. So this is actually quite a famous phrase now, but not many people know that he was the first one to use it. He joined the army in 1915 and was sent to the front in 1916. So remember, World War One was between 1914 and 1918. He showed great bravery in battle, and that's quite important as you'll see shortly. He was great friends with Siegfried Sassoon, another famous World War One poet. In April, after being blown into the air by a shell, Owen spent several days sheltering in a hole near the corpse of a fellow officer, so that means dead body, and was shortly after diagnosed with shell shock. So you can imagine this experience was probably as shocking, if not more so, than any other war experience that he had, or even of the actual shell itself. And he was a master of para rhymes, which is a type of half rhyme. So you don't need to worry too much about this for the early stages, for the lower grades. But if you're aiming higher, this is something to start thinking about. And he was tragically killed just 1 week before the end of the war. Okay, so it's a long poem and therefore quite a few words in the glossary. Please pause the video here and try and learn at least some of these words, or at least read through them 2 or 3 times. And there are some of the techniques that he uses. So I'm going to move on in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, so it's a long poem. Let's have a listen to the audio version and then we'll go through it.
Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. But nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn, massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more, in ranks on shivering ranks of grey. But nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow, with sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance. But nothing happens. Pale flakes, with fingering stealth, come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams, and stare snow-dazed, deep into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glozed with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there. For hours the innocent mice rejoice. The house is theirs, shutters and doors all closed. On us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, now ever suns smile true on child or field or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore, not loath we lie out here. Therefore we're born. For love of God seems dying. Tonight this frost will fasten on this mud and us, shrivelling many hands and puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party, picks and shovels in shaking grasp, pours over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens.
Okay, so a long poem, and as always with the long and the short poems, there's good and bad news. So with the short poems, they seem easier, but then you normally have to go quite deeply into each bit. Whereas with the longer poems, if you can show the examiner that you understand the poem as a whole, you can kind of balance that out, okay? So what we're going to do is just go through and make sure that we understand what's going on, and then we'll go a bit deeper in the second reading. Okay, so he starts off quite literally. Their brains are aching. It's so cold. I mean, even though your brain is protected by the skull, which is like a very thick, strong thing, and so therefore your brain doesn't normally ache, okay? But because it's so cold, it's going right into their brains. Here we have personification. So it's windy. There's an east wind is coming from the east, and it's the wind itself is freezing. And you may have experienced this yourselves that sometimes that happens, that the wind is so cold. Quite often, the temperature is not the problem, it's the wind. Yeah. So this wind is so cold and sharp, it feels like knives. They are tired, and but they have to keep awake, or rather they keep awake because actually you might think that if it's silent, it would help you to sleep. But actually, in this case, because it's war, the silence is nerve-wracking, and they have these flares also keeping them awake. Okay, so these things here, and the flares confuse them. Salient means something that stands out. It can also mean a piece of land that juts out. Okay, so they're worried about the silence. They're wondering if the enemy is going to attack. So it means guards. The guards, they whisper, they wonder what's going on, but nothing happens. Okay. So they're watching, and they hear the wind tugging on the wire. So mad gusts, personification. So lots of personification in this poem. And it's like when the men fall onto these wires here, they obviously struggle. So in this case, but it's the wind that's making the wire shake. And from the north, without stopping incessantly, they can hear the guns, but it seems like far away. It doesn't seem like the war that they're involved in. And here we have a rhetorical question. So notice the whole poem is these four long lines and then a short line, which says either but nothing happens, or there's a rhetorical question. So they're questioning the war, they're questioning why they're there. Poignant means sad, and misery. So the dawn comes now. Normally, dawn, when the day starts, is a hopeful sign, isn't it? So At night, if you're scared or worried, when the daylight comes, it's a hopeful thing. But for them, it's not hopeful because for them, the war carries on, the rain carries on, the clouds are still there. And then this line is ambiguous. It could be, it's probably talking about the weather, but it could also be talking about the German soldiers because the soldiers' uniform was grey. Okay, but here it's talking about the grey weather. In this case, yeah, it's the weather attacking them in the same way as the soldiers would, the enemy soldiers would, but nothing happens. And then this line, very important line. So there's alliteration or sibilance, the repeated s sound, which matches the actual sound of the bullets. But he's saying that the bullets are actually not as dangerous as the air, as the weather, as the snow, which is kind of flowing all over the place sideways. And this line also has alliteration or sibilance, the f sound. Okay. And they watch these snowflakes and wins nonchalance. So nonchalance means when you don't care about something. So again, personification. So nothing and nobody cares about them. The weather doesn't care. The enemy soldiers obviously don't care. Probably they feel that the commanders back home don't care. And as you'll see later on, that maybe even God doesn't care. And so this is the snowflakes come and settle on their faces. They cringe means to kind of move back into their holes, into their trenches, and they're dreaming. And you can see they're kind of half asleep, half dazed. They say snow dazed, sun dozed. I mean, these words, these phrases don't actually mean anything, but the effect they create is very, very clear, isn't it, on the reader? So they go back into their ditches, and now this line is confusing because blossoms means flowers, and it's unlikely that there were flowers there. So maybe he's this is kind of like a connection to the dreaming. So maybe this is now where he's dreaming of back home, really, where the flowers were and where the blackbirds were. And then here we have the rhetorical question as the fifth line. And now here, as you can see, as the poem goes on, it becomes more dreamlike. And this thing here, obviously, it's not the actual ghosts at this point because they're not dead yet. So in their mind, their souls are dreaming about home, dreaming about the fires back home. Now, this word glozed is very interesting, but we're going to talk about in the second reading and this bit here. But he's thinking about the crickets. So crickets are these insects that make that noise. So you can see here, he's kind of dreaming about back home probably. And he's thinking that at home, the houses are empty. Although that's a bit confusing because surely the relatives are there, the families are there. Anyway, personification here that because the houses are empty, or at least they're empty in the sense that the men aren't there, so the mice can play, and the shutters and doors are all closed. And here, an advanced point, there's a caesura here. Okay, there's a pause. We have to pause here, and that pause is kind of like the door closing, isn't it? They are not allowed to go back home because they have to fight. And so, as it says here, they fight because they believe that otherwise their country will be overrun, defeated by the enemy, and so therefore these fires metaphorically will go out. Okay, their freedom will be gone. The country will be taken over by the enemy. And similarly here, this is metaphorical. It's not that the sun will literally stop shining, but in the sense of the war will be over, they will be defeated. So the sun will not be able to shine on their country metaphorically. So this line here is a bit confusing. We're going to leave that till the next reading. So loath means when you don't want to do something, but he's saying they're not loath. In other words, they're willing to do this even, they don't want to be here. It's freezing, it's horrible, but they'll do it in defense of their families and their homes and their countries. And this line also is quite ambiguous. We're going to talk about this line in the second reading. So they stay here, and the freezing weather will carry on, and the frost, the freezing snow will fasten on them, take hold of them, on the mud and on them, drying up their hands, wrinkling their hands. Puckering also means to wrinkle up their foreheads. And here, this ending is a bit confusing, but it seems to suggest that some people have died from the freezing cold. Okay, so the people come and to bury them. And this bit is confusing. Does that mean that they literally didn't know those soldiers at all? Or maybe they were new and they died before anybody even had a chance to get to know them? And then it ends with the same line, but nothing happens. Okay, so long poem and quite tricky in many ways. But for your basic grade 4 5, please understand all you need to know is that he's describing the freezing weather, not so much the war itself, and basically saying that the weather was as much an enemy as the enemy soldiers. It was freezing, it was really, really horrible. So that's really the main message to take away from this first reading. Okay, so AO1, to be able to read, understand, and respond to the poem using quotes and references. Loads of quotes there. You only need about 4, remember, for a grade 4 or 5. Here are some techniques, and I've given you the examples there. By all means, pause the video and go through those. I'm going to move on. 3, 2, 1. And I've packed this together so it'll go on to one slide. So AO2, language, form and structure, techniques and terminology. So language means words and phrases, thoughts, feelings, images, alternative meanings of a word. So some of these examples from the previous slide. In terms of form and structure, it's not a specific type, form of poem as such. It's a long poem, the whole of it being a description of the effect of the weather, okay, with brief references to the actual war, but not really about the war itself, and ending in death, which is due to the weather, not the war. The poem is composed of 8 stanzas of 5 lines each, where the last line is noticeably shorter than the others. There is a clear rhyme and rhythm scheme with very specific features, and we'll talk about this more in the second reading. I mean, normally if you just say something like this, you're not going to get that many marks. So if you're wondering what to say about that, you might say something like, Owen, he really took his poetry seriously, okay? He didn't just see himself as a war poet, as somebody reporting on the war. Yes, that was his main subject, but he really, really took his poetry seriously and he learnt from the masters and he really practiced very, very hard. And he would have been a great poet anyway. If he hadn't been in the war, he would have probably wrote about other things. And you can see that very clearly in the way he creates his poems and it crafts them. Okay, in terms of techniques and terminology, Owen uses many techniques, but especially personification, rhetorical questions, and repetition. And then in terms of context, you could mention that he wrote from personal experience, which is not always the case. So one of the poems in the anthology is Bayonet Charge, Ted Hughes, and he did not write from personal experience, although he wrote from his father's experience. You could refer to his phrase, the pity of war, although this is for the higher grades, okay? His mastery of para rhyme. So this is a tricky phrase, but essentially just means half rhyme where words don't fully rhyme, only bits of them rhyme. And the fact that he was killed just 1 week before the end of the war adds extra pathos to our reading of his poetry. So pathos means something that creates pity. So that kind of ties back to this phrase here. Okay, so you have now learned more than enough to get a grade 4 or 5 for this long, difficult poem. Here is a quiz to test your understanding so far. Please pause the video here and have a good go at these questions. I'm going to move on in 3 seconds. So 3, 2, 1. And here are the answers. So please check your answers. If you really struggled, you need to go back and listen again. And as always, once you've mastered these questions, all you have to do is to add a bit more detail and convert them into flowing sentences and paragraphs. So, for example, you might get a question like this. How does the poet present the theme of war in Exposure? Compare with one other poem in the anthology, which we're not going to do here, but you could compare with the prelude. So notice remember in the prelude, the weather suddenly changes, or Storm on the Island, which again is about the weather suddenly changing. I mean, in this poem, the weather doesn't change, okay? But the poem is about the weather and the power of the weather, power of nature. So we've looked at these two poems already. Or, so Exposure is a tricky one. It's an interesting one. It fits in either with the war poems or with the power of nature, power of the weather poems. Or if you want to use the weather aspect of it, sorry, the war aspect of it, then you could compare with these two poems, which we're going to look at later. So you might start something like this. The poet presents the theme of war in the poem by describing the freezing cold that the soldiers had to endure. Endure means to put up with, and hence suggesting that the war itself is not the only enemy. The weather can be just as bad, if not worse, than the war. He uses techniques such as personification to do this. The poem begins by using personification to show that the wind was so cold that it felt like it was stabbing them. Merciless iced east winds that knife us. The effect and connotations of the adjective merciless and the verb to knife is to show that the wind is as much the enemy as the opposing soldiers are. So about 4 paragraphs like that, plus an introduction and conclusion and a bit of context, would be more than enough to get a grade 4-5. If you're aiming higher, you can carry on. So in terms of tone and mood, I think we can agree that the tone and mood are the same and they're basically sad and pitiful. Now, in terms of rhyming, let's have a look at the rhyme scheme. So, us, silent, salient, nervous. So, knife, us, nervous. Can you see the half rhyme there, the para rhyme? Silent, salient. Can you see only a bit of the word rhymes, not both? Wire, brambles, rumbles, war. Wire and war only partly rhymes. Brambles, rumbles, only partly rhymes. Okay, so there is a rhyme scheme, definitely. It's kind of A, B, B, A, but the rhyming is half rhyme, para rhymes. And then in terms of rhythm, I mean, you can count the syllables if you want, but counting syllables is not the most important thing to do. But what you can see straight away is and the number of syllables you can actually just see visibly. So you can see you've got these 4 long lines and then followed by a short line. Okay. Obviously, you have to say something about that. So you could say the long lines are reflective of the fact that the weather, the freezing cold, goes on and on. The war goes on and on. And then this last line is shorter, both to reflect that nothing happens or to emphasize the effect of the rhetorical question. Now, in terms of form and structure, we've kind of covered that with the rhyme and the rhythm and the lengths of the lines and so on. And the fact that actually, in terms of structure, the tone and mood don't really change, although it does become more and more metaphorical towards the end, in the sense that partly because it becomes more dreamlike at the end. Okay. In terms of language, I'm going to just point out 2 things. So the word glozed is interesting. It's a made up word and it's a combination of different people have different versions of this. Some people say it's about glowed and dozed. I think it's a combination of glowed, so when something sparkles, right, when it's on fire, and glazed, which means shining. So it's like these coals which are shining red. So it's a really interesting word or combination of words there. And then just this one here, for love of God seems dying. That's interesting because it could be interpreted in 2 ways. On the one hand, it could mean that they show their love of God by dying, and that's the kind of surface meaning, I think. but also it could mean, and this could be Owen's hidden meaning, that their their love for God is dying because of the war. They're losing faith in God. Okay, so that's a couple of advanced things to think about. Here is an advanced quiz to test your understanding of that so far. I'm going to please pause and answer these questions. I'm going to move on in 3 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Here are the possible answers. Please check your answers. If you struggled, go back and listen again. And moving on. 3, 2, 1. And to finish off, you have now learnt more than enough for a grade 6 or 7. Such a paragraph might look like this. The poet presents the theme of war. So actually, up to here is the same as before. And then I've added this. The poem is highly effective in achieving Owen's goal of describing the pity of war. The fact that Owen showed great bravery in battle adds to this because we know that he was not someone to complain for no reason. Furthermore, the fact that he died just 1 week before the end adds even more pathos to the poem. And you could actually add here that what pathos means and how it ties back to this thing here. So this means something that creates pity. For grade 8, 9, some possibilities might be to discuss this alliteration or sibilance. Okay. Also, what do you think is the combination of words that make up this glozed made up word here and the double meaning possibly of this phrase here? You could discuss the power rhymes, okay, and why he might have used them, and the pity of war, this phrase here that he was the first one to use. And as a final, very high grade point you might want to make is that here you got the sir, but then you got fur here as well, and the sir. Now, on the one hand, you might think that's breaking the alliteration or the sibilance, but actually, technically, it's not because we call these the sir, the fur sounds, fricative sounds. All right, so they still have that sound, which matches the sound of the bullets. So it's a very clever way of doing things, even though at first glance you might think that the sir and the fur don't go together. Okay, so that's that. And as a final task, you could please complete the essay we started. How does the poet present the theme of war in exposure? And that's it. Hopefully you found that video useful. Long, difficult poem, but we had a good go at it. And I will see you in the next video. And please don't forget to subscribe and tell all your friends. And I will see you in the next video for the next poem.